Good morning. This is Friday, the 16th of March. My name is Ron. Welcome to Story Time. And today is part one of chapter 11, An Untitled Letter from 1973 from Ayn Rand's book Philosophy, Who Needs It? The most appropriate title for this discussion would be, quote, I told you so, unquote. But since that would be in somewhat dubious taste, I shall leave this untitled. In Atlas Shrugged and in many subsequent articles, I said that the advocates of mysticism are motivated not by a quest for truth, but by hatred for man's mind, that the advocates of the altruism are motivated not by compassion for suffering, but by hatred for man's life, that the advocates of collectivism are motivated not by a desire for man's happiness, but by hatred for man, and that their three doctrines come from the same root and blend into a single passion, hatred of the good for being the good, and that the focus of that hatred, the target of its passionate fury, is the man of ability. Those who thought that I was exaggerating have seen event after event confirm my diagnosis. Reality has been providing me with references and footnotes, including explicit admissions by the advocates of those doctrines. The admissions are becoming progressively louder and clearer. The major ideological campaigns of the mystic altruist collectivist axis are usually preceded by trial balloons that test the public reaction to an attack on certain fundamental principles. Today, a new kind of intellectual balloon is beginning to bubble in the popular press, testing the climate for a large-scale attack intended to obliterate the concept of justice. The new balloons acquire the mark of a campaign by carrying, like little identification tags, the code words, quote, a new justice, unquote. This does not mean that the campaign is consciously directed by some mysterious powers. It is a conspiracy, not of men, but of basic premises, and the power directing it is logic. If, at the desperate stage of a losing battle, some men point to a road logically necessitated by their basic premises, those who share the premises will rush to follow. Since my capacity for intellectual slumming is limited, I do not know who originated this campaign at this particular time. Its philosophical roots are ancient. The first instance that came to my attention was a brief news item over a year ago. Dr. Jan Tinbergen from the Netherlands, who had received a Nobel Prize in economic science, spoke at an international conference in New York City and suggested, quote, that there might be a tax on personal capabilities. A modest first step might be a special tax on persons with high academic scores, he said, unquote. We reprinted this item in the, quote, horror file, unquote, of The Objectivist, June 1971. The reaction of my friends when they read it was an incredulously indignant amusement, with remarks such as, quote, he's crazy, unquote. But it is not amusing any longer when a news item in the New York Times, January 2nd, 1973, announces that Pope Paul VI, quote, issued a call today for a new justice. True justice recognizes that all men are in substance equal, the pontiff said. The littler, the poorer, the more suffering, the more defenseless, even the lower a man has fallen, the more he deserves to be assisted, raised up, cared for, and honored. We learn this from the gospel, unquote. Observe the package deal. To be little, poor, suffering, defenseless is not necessarily to be immoral. It depends on the cause of these conditions. But even the lower a man has fallen implies in this context not misfortune, but immorality. Are we asked to absorb the notion that the lower a man's vices, the more concern he deserves and the more honor Another package deal to be assisted, raised up, cared for obviously does not apply to those who are great, rich, happy, or strong. They do not need it. But to be honored, they are the men who would have to do the assisting, the raising up, the caring for, but they do not deserve to be honored. They deserve less honor than the man who is saved by their virtues and values. In Atlas Shrugged, exposing the meaning of altruism, John Galt says, quote, "What passkey admits you to the moral elite? The passkey is lack of value. Whatever the value involved, it is your lack of it that gives you a claim upon those who don't lack it. To demand rewards for your virtue is selfish and immoral. It is your lack of virtue that transforms your demand into a moral right." Unquote. What is an abstract ethical suggestion in the Pope's message becomes specific and political in a brief piece that appeared in the Times on January 20th, 1973, quote, "The New Inequality," unquote, by Peregrine Worsthorne, a columnist for the Sunday Telegraph of London. In addition to altruism, which is its base, this piece was made possible by two premises. One, the refusal to recognize the difference between mind and force, i.e., between economic and political power, and two, the refusal to recognize the difference between existence and consciousness, i.e., between the metaphysical and the man-made. Those who ignore or evade the crucial importance of these distinctions will find Mr. Peregrine Worsthorne ready to welcome them at the end of their road. There was a time, Mr. Worsthorne begins, when, quote, "gross hereditary inequalities of wealth, status, and power were universally accepted as a divinely ordained fact of life," unquote. He is speaking of feudalism and of the British caste system. But modern man, he says, quote, "finds this awfully difficult to understand. To him it seems absolutely axiomatic that each individual ought to be allowed to make his grade according to merit, regardless of the accident of birth. All positions of power, wealth, and status should be open to talent. To the extent that this ideal is achieved, a society is deemed to be just." Unquote. If you think that this is a proclamation of individualism, think twice. Modern liberals, Mr. Worsthorne continues, quote, have tended to believe that it is fair enough that the men of merit should be on top and the man without merit should be underneath, unquote. On top of what? Underneath what? Mr. Worsthorne doesn't say. Judging by the rest of the piece, his answer would be on top of anything: political power, self-made wealth, scientific achievement, artistic genius, the status of earned respect, or of a government-granted title of nobility. Anything anyone may ever want or envy. The current social malaise, he explains, is caused by, quote, "the increasing evidence that this assumption about a just society should be challenged. The ideal of a meritocracy no longer commands such universal assent." Unquote. Meritocracy is an old anti-concept and one of the most contemptible package deals. By means of nothing more than its last 5 letters, that word obliterates the difference between mind and force. It equates the men of ability with political rulers, and the power of their creative achievements with political power. There is no difference, the word suggests, between freedom and tyranny. An aristocracy is tyranny by a politically established elite. A democracy is a tyranny by the majority. And when a government protects individual rights, the result is tyranny by talent or merit. And since to merit means to deserve, a free society is ruled by the tyranny of justice. Mr. Worsthorne makes the most of it. He furthers his package dealing. His further package dealing becomes cruder and easier. Quote, "It used to be considered manifestly unjust that a child should be given an enormous head start in life simply because he was the son of an earl or of a member of the landed gentry. But what about a child today born of affluent, educated parents whose family life gets him off to a head start in the educational ladder? Is he not the beneficiary of a form of hereditary privilege no less unjust than that enjoyed by the aristocracy? What about Thomas Edison, the Wright brothers, Commodore Vanderbilt? By the way, it was then no less than that enjoyed by the aristocracy, unquote. What about Thomas Edison, the Wright brothers, Commodore Vanderbilts, Henry Ford Sr., or, in politics, Abraham Lincoln and their enormous head start in life? On the other hand, what about the Park Avenue hippies or the drug eaten children of college bred intellectuals and multimillionaires? Mr. Worsthorne, it seems, had counted on, quote, universal public education, unquote, to level things down, but it has disappointed him. Quote, family life, he declares, is more important than school life in determining brain power. Educational qualifications are today what amorial quarterings were in feudal times. Yet access to them is almost as unfairly determined by accidents of birth as was access to the nobility. Unquote. This, he says, defeats, quote, any genuine faith in equality of opportunity, unquote, and, quote, accounts for the current populist clamor to do away with educational distinctions such as exams and diplomas, since they are seen as the latest form of privilege, which, in a sense, they are, unquote. This means that if a young student named, say, Thomas Hendricks, after days and nights of conscientious study, proves that he knows the subject of medicine and passes an exam, he's given an arbitrary privilege, an unfair advantage over a young student named Lee Hunsaker, who spent his time in a drugged daze listening to rock music. And if Hendricks gets a diploma and a job in a hospital, while Hunsaker does not, Hunsaker will scream that he could not help it and that he never had a chance. Volitional effort? There is no such thing. Brain power? It's determined by family life. And he couldn't help it if mom and pop did not condition him to be willing to study. He is entitled to a job in a hospital, and a just society would guarantee it to him. The fate of the patients? He's as good as any other fellow. All men are in substance equal. And the only difference between him and the privileged bastards is a diploma granted as unfairly as amorial quarterings. Equal opportunity, don't make him laugh. Socialists, Mr. Worsthorne remarks, have used the ideal of equality of opportunity as, quote, a way of moving in the right, that is to say, the left direction, unquote. They regarded it as, quote, the thin edge of the egalitarian wedge, unquote. Then suddenly, Mr. Worsthorne starts dispensing advice to the right, which the left has always insisted on doing, and with good reason. Any rightist who accepts it deserves it. His advice, as usual, involves a threat and counts on fear. Quote, but there is a problem here for the right quite as much as for the left. It seems to me certain that there will be a growing awareness in the coming decades of the unfairness of existing society, of the new forms of arbitrary allocation of power, status, and privilege. Resentment will build up against the new meritocracy, just as it builds up against the old aristocracy and plutocracy. The right, he claims, unquote, the right, he claims, must, quote, devise new ways of disarming this resentment without so curbing the high flyers, so penalizing excellence, or so imposing uniformity as to destroy the spirit of a free and dynamic society, unquote. Observe that he permits himself to grasp and cynically to admit that such an issue as the penalizing of excellence is involved, but he regards it as the right's concern, not his own, and he does not object to penalizing virtue for being virtue, provided the penalties do not go to extremes. This in an article written as an appeal for justice. And that's the end of part 1 of chapter 11, which is called An Untitled Letter. And a couple of things that I wanted couple of things I wanted to note here, and that she's talking about, where again Ayn Rand is deeper than Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity or any of the other talk radio people by a considerable margin. But even she has a tendency to be not quite deep enough. So she is analyzing again the Dr. Jan Tinberg's statement from the Netherlands about attacks on personal capabilities and about the Pope issuing a call for new justice. And she talks about package deals, that about the men who would have to do the assisting, the raising up, and the caring for, and not being honored. Let's see, the hatred of the good for being the good. That's the whole thing that I really wanted to get to, where really what's going on the left is not a hatred of the good for being the good. It is a hatred of values for being values. The only way that the left can perpetrate the fraud of socialism and the fraud of socialist paradise is by getting rid of knowledge and therefore values. And as a matter of fact, also getting rid of metaphysical reality. Because when you look at socialism in the cold hard light of metaphysical reality, you realize it doesn't work. It just doesn't add up. So in order to get people to accept socialism, they have to get rid of that reality. And to get rid of that reality, they're going to have to get rid of all of reality. So they promote a subjectivist, a consciousness, primacy of consciousness kind of a man's mindset, saying that all realities are psychological in nature and that all of them are man-made realities. And if in a reality that's man-made can be undone. Man can make it, man can destroy it, reform it, remake it, etc. So that plays right into their hands. The unfortunate thing for them is that it is simply untrue. There are metaphysical realities, whether the left likes it or not. And so again, how Ayn Rand should have written this and looked at the situation was going a little bit deeper instead of being upset about people being offended by the good for being the good. What they're really doing is being offended with values for being values. One of the ways, if you want to get rid of ugliness, is to get rid of beauty, is to get rid of standards, right? So you can also run around and tell people don't judge people for being ugly. But if you have the standard to begin with, if there's a standard of right and wrong and ugly and beautiful and real and unreal, those standards, as long as they're there, people are going to make those judgments. So if you do away with those standards, people won't be able to make those comparisons. They won't be able to have those values. So she, like I said, it would be good if she went a little bit deeper. Also, she has a tendency, one of the reasons that her ideas aren't as popular as they should be is because she has a tendency to be a little bit stilted in the way that she communicates. She refers to package deals. And so that's kind of an awkward way of putting things. And so she also talks about being raised up, cared for, and which doesn't apply to those who are great, rich, happy, or strong. They do not need it. But to be honored, they are the men who would have to do the assisting, the raising up, the caring for, but they do not deserve to be honored. They deserve less honor than the man who is saved by their virtues and values. And the other thing that she's missing here in regards to the Pope is the fact that all of those things that she's describing there are worldly. The church is supposed to be about things that are not worldly. They are supposed to be about, the church is supposed to be about one's immortal soul. That's the church's concern, proper concern, not raising up the fallen, the poor, the suffering, the defenseless. And also where it says, we learn this from the gospel, we learn no such thing. Jesus says that you should take your money and your possessions, give it away to the poor, and follow me. And what he means by that is give up material things and material interests and look to your immortal soul. And the church is missing that because the church is now becoming involved in income equality and justice and all kinds of other worldly issues that have absolutely nothing to do with confessing confessing that Jesus Christ is your Lord and Savior, which is what's going to save you to begin with. You can have all run around trying to promote justice all you want to, but if you do so as a pagan, as a Buddhist, as a um, Islamicist, as a Jew, perhaps even, you're not going to get into heaven. You've got to be able to do it. You've got to be able to do things in a Christian way. You first and foremost have to confess your belief in Jesus Christ. But again, it goes right back to your immortal soul. It is not about things that are secular or worldly. So tomorrow and Saturday, I'm going to be doing parts 2 and 3 of this chapter, and hopefully have it finished up by Sunday. But until then, thank you very much for listening, and have a good day.